Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. Now I would like to present you our next panel, Public Goods, the refugee and internally displaced persons crisis across the world today and the role of education. Our moderator today is Mr. Jonas Zad, World Bank Country Director, Turkey. Our speakers are Mr. Daniel Pauls, founder and CEO of PAS USA, Dean of Social Sciences and Humanities, Director of the Migration Research Center, Koç University, Ms. Hanan Sayed, Program Leader, World Bank MENA, Mr. Hüsam Abu Isa, Vice President, Salam International.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us after a very delicious lunch this afternoon. We have a number of panelists here who are going to talk about the refugee crisis that is evident around the world today. Just by way of introduction, I'd like to remind everyone in the audience that today there are about 60 million refugees and internally displaced people in the world. That's a little less than 1% of the global population. Hosting countries provide a global public good by inviting these people into their countries and helping them to manage the crisis during the period of its period. And we are, of course, living in a part of the world right now that has seen the refugee crisis explode locally. Turkey is now the single largest refugee hosting country in the world, with about 2.2 million refugees, mostly from Syria. Neighboring Lebanon and Jordan and Iraq are also hosting Syrian refugees, and proportionate to their populations, at least for Lebanon and Jordan, the relative weight of the refugee burden in those countries is extremely high. To give a sense of how difficult this problem has become, the problem of hosting refugees around the world, only about 130,000 refugees actually returned to their home country in 2014, which is the smallest number of returnees in many, many years. I think we will have an opportunity in the course of this panel to talk a little bit about Turkey's way of managing the refugee population here. It's unique because it is both a non-camp administration as well as a government-financed administration. And that's quite different from most countries which tend to host refugees in camps and provide support through humanitarian aid organizations. Obviously, from the perspective of a refugee, being in a host community which allows you to become a member of that society is socially and economically advantageous because it promotes self-reliance. It makes it more possible for you as a refugee to contribute economically to the host country, and it also makes it more likely that you will be successful in reintegrating into your home country when conditions allow. That said, there are many, many challenges that hosting communities face. They're illustrated in Turkey, but also Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. And these are challenges around labor and employment, around accessing healthcare and educational services, acquiring housing, enabling communities to provide municipal services for expanded populations, and also maintaining social cohesion between refugee populations and hosting communities. What we will discuss this afternoon is how a few different countries are trying to address these different challenges and how successfully they are doing so. I'm going to start the discussions with my World Bank colleague to my left, Hanan Sayed, who's a program leader for the World Bank in the countries of Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. And she will be talking about the situation of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. So, Hanan, over to you.
Good afternoon. I'd like first to thank the organizers of this wonderful event for inviting the World Bank, for inviting me to participate, and to speak to you about a topic which has been engulfing us if you will, for the past 4 years, at least from where I sit in Lebanon, in the World Bank Sub-Regional Office. And what I'd like to present today are some of the challenges that the refugee hosting countries of Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq are facing. Somewhat not in too much detail, but to give you a sense of the effect and the impact, and then point to some of the solutions and then the challenges. Because even though we are now in the 5th year of the Syrian conflict, it's fair to say that while a lot has been achieved and a lot now is known in terms of development agencies, in terms of actors, of what to do, and a lot of funding has indeed come to the region, I think it's still fair to say that still the road is very difficult ahead. And interestingly enough, the challenges are getting tougher and more difficult. So as Johannes actually already mentioned, today we have 60 million displaced people worldwide. Now, in fact, the majority of them are what's called internally displaced persons, IDPs, people who are had to leave, forced to leave their homes, but are still within the areas of their countries. And then about 20% are refugees. This is worldwide. Zeroing in on the Syrian conflict, we have about today 4.3 million displaced people. This is considered one of the largest refugee crises in post-World War II. As you probably all know the number, Turkey does host the largest number in terms of absolute figures, a little over 2 million, and then Lebanon with about 1.1 million, Jordan is about 630,000, and then Iraq about 240,000, and then a little bit under 130,000 in Egypt. But when we look at it in terms of proportion to population, you'll see that the situation is very dramatic for Lebanon, for example, where 25% of its population, if not maybe 30%, are refugees. And this is only the registered refugees. This is from UNHCR data. So we know that there are many who are not registered for various reasons. And also this does not include the previous influxes of refugees that Lebanon has had, whether it be from Iraq or from, of course, Palestine. Jordan comes second in terms of the ratio of refugees to total population at about a little over 10%. But also Jordan, if you were to count other refugee populations from Iraq and elsewhere, you also see a percentage much higher. Turkey, because of its very large population, of course the percentage is small, but of course absolute number we mentioned is very high. And then the other figure here is very confusing with arrows going all over, but just to give you a sense of what's happening in terms of migration, refugees leaving from the region and from various parts of the region going to Europe. The number here actually of 445,000 refugees in Greece is already outdated. By the time that that map was done, the number had actually increased much, today it's about 800,000 arrivals, total refugees, not only Syrian, this includes Afghani and Iraqi as well, that are going to Europe, mainly landing in Greece and Italy. Here, I want to show you on Lebanon. Indeed, Lebanon, actually Lebanon also is even more unique than Turkey in its no camp policy. There were no formal camps established in Lebanon. So what you had essentially is the 1.2 officially registered refugees scattered all over the country, living in communities, in urban areas, in rural areas. And this series of maps of Lebanon show you what happened from 2012 to 2015, the increase of the refugees, the blue dots basically being settlements of different sizes of refugees. And you will see how, of course, they started in the north and then very quickly spread throughout. So that today there's almost no community in Lebanon which does not have some proportion of refugees. The spread was very, very fast. 2013, 2014 were the peak. This year, we are seeing a slowdown. There is, in fact, the Lebanese government is not allowing, unless under exceptional circumstances, more refugees. But still, the number, as you can imagine, as I mentioned, is anywhere from 25 to 30% of the population, already very high. And what has happened is that while no formal camps have been established by the government, and this has to partly do with historical trauma that the Lebanese people feel vis-a-vis the establishment of Palestinian camps over the years, what has happened is that many informal tented settlements have developed throughout the country. So groups of refugee families, anywhere from 10 families to 40 families, will plot themselves on a piece of land, which is privately owned, and they will rent from the landowner, typically an agricultural piece of land, and they will put some makeshift tents. And these ITSs, or informal tented settlements, conditions even far, far worse than one can imagine. Jordan did establish camps the more traditional way, with UNHCR going in there and setting up the camps with the various facilities and the like. And they tended to be concentrated in the north. 3 formal camps were established. The biggest one of them is Za'atari camp. However, we've seen that over time, people leave the camp, and now the camps, which used to host maybe at some point 50% of the refugees, never more than that, now at most 15%, 1/5 of the refugees are in the camps. It's kind of a normal tendency of people trying to go out, especially after prolonged displacement period, go out and try to find their livelihood in the community. Iraq, slightly different situation. The number of refugees per se is small, but what Iraq has very dramatically are very large numbers of internally displaced people, particularly in the northern part, around Baghdad and in the northern part. Maybe more than 3 million internally displaced people in Iraq, which is also putting a huge strain on the government. So very briefly, who are the refugees? This is derived from a study that the World Bank conducted with UNHCR, looking at very detailed at the data that UNHCR has when they register refugees. And we basically were trying to understand who they are, what their background is, where they come from. And one of the various features or results of this is that the majority of the refugees in Jordan and Lebanon are distinct, i.e. different from either the populations where they lived before. So even those in certain areas that came, let's say, from Dar'a or other parts of Syria, were different from their native population there. They had been displaced several times already in Syria before coming over the border to Jordan or to Lebanon. And of course, they are also different in terms of their socioeconomic characteristics vis-a-vis the local populations of Jordan and Lebanon. They tend to be economically distressed populations that have, as I mentioned, been affected by prolonged drought. Prior to 2011, you may all recall that Syria, globally there was droughts, and Syria was affected by a very difficult drought in the north. And that moved almost 1 million people from parts of Syria to the borders, to the slum areas around the cities. And these became big, strong candidates for who became then refugees later. The refugee population is very young. More than 80% of them are less than 35 years of age, so you can imagine the implications. They have low levels of education. 80% have primary education or below. Now, we also know, however, of course, that there's many, many educated Syrians who left Syria, and they are in Turkey, they are in Lebanon, they are in Europe, they are in the US. But this is capturing those that are registered with UNHCR. So that population has, unfortunately, very low levels of education, partly also reflecting the young age, but also this gives you an indication of the challenge going forward. 80% women and children, the majority of them are poor, 50 to 70% of them fall below whatever poverty line you want to draw, whether it's the Jordanian poverty line, the Lebanese, or their own poverty line, they are very poor. And as I said, most of them are not in camps. So in 2013, the government of Lebanon requested the World Bank to assess the impact of the Syrian conflict more largely, not just the presence of Syrian refugees, but the conflict more broadly, on its economy and on its social structure and on its infrastructure. And so we did that. We did what's called an economic and social impact assessment, a document which was the first of its kind to point to the impact and measure the magnitude of the impact that the conflict next door has on the country. Until then, the discourse and the attention and the thinking was much more about the welfare of the refugees, which was very important and remains to be top priority. However, there wasn't much thinking about the impact on the host communities, on the populations themselves. So this is the first, this study that was done in 2013 by the World Bank and which was presented at the United Nations General Assembly at that time at the level of heads of state, essentially quantified that the Lebanese economy had contracted, growth was cut by almost 3 percentage points between 2012 2014. 2014, of course, being a projection because this study was done in 2013. The fiscal impact on Lebanon was huge. It was 2.6 billion in direct fiscal impact, whether it be reduction of revenues or increase in spending. Demand on public services was very large. There was a surge in demand, which was partly accommodated by either quality declining or access declining. The impact on the labor market, this is the most challenging issue to this day, including in Turkey, and I think we will hear about this later, but unemployment rates doubled already from high unemployment rates, particularly among the youth and the unskilled. And this also had a dampening effect on wages, so wages were seen to be going down. Poverty increased among the Lebanese. And finally, we had issue of social cohesion. So on the one hand, you had in Lebanon, and you're probably all familiar with the complicated confessional balance that Lebanon has. Until now, we don't have, for example, fortunately, major strife erupting between communities, but there's significant levels of aggravation, which is like at a teetering point. At any point, it can blow up further. But it's definitely fair to say that social cohesion is something to be watched, and tension between the refugee populations and the hosts. Quickly on Jordan, similar impacts. We've seen 1 percentage point drops in GDP growth in 2013, and fiscal impact and the like. And also on Iraq, where we also did a similar impact assessment for KRG, the Kurdistan region. We also find where a lot of the IDPs, refugees, are concentrated. We also find overall poverty to have increased and estimated decline in GDP. And if I may just zero in on some human development impacts, partly because this session also does talk about, education is important, and I happen to also work in human development sector. But we see that this has been really significant impacts on the local population, whether it be on the health, where you have a rise of certain communicable diseases, the emergence of certain diseases that didn't exist in Lebanon or Jordan, that from the rural areas in Syria came in. And then a huge demand on health services, primary health care, but also hospitals and emergencies and deliveries. In education, take Lebanon alone, 450,000 school-age Syrian children. The entire population of Lebanese students in the public schools is 350,000. So one can't even begin to imagine how can you accommodate more than 100% of your, expand your capacity more than 100%. This is happening slowly. There's been significant support from the international community on education. You probably all have heard of the No Lost Generation Initiative, Mr. Gordon Brown, the special envoy to Ban Ki-moon, and others who have been really ringing the bells for providing resources to educate Syrian children because if they are not educated, their future is entirely lost. And despite all these efforts and the hundreds of millions of dollars that have come in to education, both in Lebanon and in Jordan, we still have more than 60% of the Syrian children are out of school. It's just simply so hard and challenging for any system to be able to expand so quickly. Another important human development impact is on employment and livelihood. As I mentioned, unemployment in Lebanon, we know, has overall increased, but informality has increased because much of the kind of work, if you will, that refugees are taking up essentially are in the informal sector. And similarly on poverty and demand for social safety nets. Now, you're probably all wondering, but there has to be some positives. Any economist would tell you if you have more people consuming, demanding, then there will be some impact, some positive impact. And yes, there is. But what we measured in the 2013 economic social impact assessment is that on balance, it has been a negative for the country. Here, just as I mentioned on the school age, to show you graphically, the purple is still the bulk of school-age children in Lebanon, Syrian refugees who still need to be accommodated despite all the good efforts. Finally, let me just quickly some more general points. So what is the international community's response, and what are some of the lessons we can draw from this? For the first couple of years of the crisis, it's been a pure humanitarian approach. So let's go in there and provide what UNHCR and UNICEF and other UN agencies and the international NGOs can do very well, which is go in, either set up the camp or provide relief, protection, and the like. And that's been the main obsession. And in fact, we as World Bank, a development agency which does not have a humanitarian mandate, really were not doing much. There wasn't really much. It was a humanitarian response. But then it became clear that that can't be it. First, the conflict looked like it was going to be prolonged, and it still does look like this today, 4 years later. But also, we realized that the approach has to shift. The whole infrastructure of the host countries is affected. The local populations, the hosts, are feeling the impact. And so a different approach, a developmental approach, is what is needed today going forward to be able to really address the issue of the refugees. And if we look at in terms of aid, I mentioned there's quite a bit of humanitarian aid that has come year after year, but still it is way underfunded. No more than 50%, 60% of the needs, still 60% are underfunded. And most of this funding has gone to refugees, rightly so, that's where the needs are, but then the needs of the host community and the countries have been on the back burner until recently. So what you will see in the most recent appeal that the United Nations did, which was launched last Monday, this Monday, December 7th in Geneva, you'll see a much bigger part of the appeal going to what's called resilience of the host countries and the host communities. So this is to help the hosting countries bear the brunt and build their national systems to be able to respond to the refugee needs. And very important is the need for predictable multi-year funding. Humanitarian aid, by definition, is allocated year by year. And the problem here is that Minister of Education does not know next year how many kids he can put in school if he does not know his funding that should be coming. So we are also calling for this kind of funding, this kind of change. And so just to show you, as I mentioned, these numbers from the most recent refugee plea of UNHCR, we're now estimating 4.7 million refugees registered by the end of this year. 4 million members of the host communities in need of direct assistance. So these are the poor, vulnerable communities in Lebanon and Jordan, in Turkey, in Iraq, in Egypt, that also need support, that are impacted by the large presence of refugees. It's 4 million. And the appeal this year is almost $6 billion that is being asked the international community. But as I mentioned, we know that humanitarian aid, there isn't enough, not only because grants are limited by definition in the world economy, but also because there are other humanitarian crises going on in the rest of the world. The Syrian one is not the only one. And the other challenge is that the countries which are hosting refugees, this is somewhat kind of unique, not totally unique, but different from other refugee incidences around the world, whether they be Turkey, Lebanon, or Jordan. These are middle-income countries. Therefore, they are not eligible for a lot of the concessional financing that development agencies like the World Bank or the EIB or the EBRD have at their disposal. So they end up having to either request the humanitarian aid, which is not enough, but yet are not, logically, they're not going to borrow for refugees. So they're caught in the middle, and yet they are providing the world, the globe, Europe in particular, a very important public good by hosting the refugees. So there is very important, urgent need to look for other sources of financing, other concessional funds that can be allocated to middle-income countries. A much more, what do we mean by development approach? I mean, shifting this paradigm from humanitarian to, part of it is about jobs, yes, you need to create jobs for refugees so that they can live and become more self-sufficient. On the other hand, we also have to create those jobs for the host communities because, as I mentioned, Lebanon and Jordan and other countries had high unemployment before the refugee crisis. So you will have to find ways to have jobs for both communities. And upgrading host country systems, making it more of a politically sensitive approach, which I think is sometimes forgotten in this midst of humanitarian urgency. Let me stop at this, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Haneen. You will have noticed in the program that Professor Ahmed İçdoğu, who's the Dean of the College of Social Science and Humanities at Koç University, was expected to be with us this afternoon, but he's not been able to make it. Instead, we will hear a few words from his colleague, Çağrı Hürmüzlü, who is a researcher at the Migration Research Center at Koç University, as well as a former staff member of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Çağrı?
Hello. Thanks very much. First of all, I'd like to apologize on behalf of the professor, but also say that I'm quite happy that he canceled, because I'm going to be speaking on his behalf, which is a nice opportunity for me. I'm going to keep it really short, not go into too much statistics about the Syrian crisis in Turkey. It's going to be based on 3 topics, just general information on the current situation of Syrian refugees in Turkey. Second, the main problems that we're facing. And a third, a little bit about international burden sharing and kind of the relationship with Turkey and the EU. So as our last presenter very accurately gave us a good description about the situation in the surrounding countries, I'll just talk a little bit about the Turkish context. As everybody knows, in 2011, when the onset of the crisis erupted, Turkey's #1 policy was to maintain an open door policy and create camps in the southeast of Turkey. But politically, the Turkish government continued to call refugees guests, misafir. We kept using the term. And the term guests was used as a political statement, but also because the Turkish government, and I guess the other countries in the surrounding areas, thought that this wouldn't be such a protracted situation. This is a temporary situation, and that people would eventually go back. That, of course, didn't happen. The numbers kept piling up, but I'm proud to say, as a citizen of this country, that the open door policy remained open, despite the large influx of population. Now we're seeing the numbers at 2.2 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. And this is going to be tied to the problems that I'm going to talk about, is statistics also, because we're not really sure of the exact numbers, and you touched upon this, and I think this is an important aspect. If we want to really solve the situation, we've got to look at the statistics. But let's just keep the 2.2 million as our base right now. 2.2 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. As you know, the Turkish government has spent, as our latest statement, up to $8 billion on the humanitarian effort. Most of the money has been funneled into camp-based activities. There's approximately 24 camps right now in the southeast of Turkey, but they're only housing approximately just over 200,000 Syrian refugees. So that leaves a huge proportion, almost 1.8, outside of the camps. And this is another topic that I'm going to come into as a problem, which is the kind of shift of camp-based provision of services to a more urban setting. We're talking about urban refugees, and that changes the whole programmatic setup, the whole way humanitarian assistance is provided. So in Turkey, it isn't a camp-based situation. I would say that this is an urban refugee situation. Policies have to be tailored to suit that. If we're going to look at some of the policy steps that Turkey took, immediately refugees were granted health services in Turkey. Any Syrian refugee right now is allowed to receive healthcare services in any healthcare institute in Turkey. Recently, there were specialized clinics that were set up, especially in Istanbul as well, that are basically literally translated into migrant clinics, where any migrant or refugee can go and get assistance. So on the health aspect, it is pretty promising. Education, to tie it in a little bit into today's discussion. In education, it's not as positive. If we look at the camp-based setting, the last statistics, I believe, which was Human Rights Watch that just published their report on this, was about 97% of children are receiving educations in the camps. However, when you step outside the camps in the urban situation, that number dramatically decreases. Currently, there are around 700,000 children who are aged, that should be going to school right now. Only 212,000 are in schools, are receiving primary or secondary education. That's over just under 500,000 children that are not receiving education for the past 3 years. If we look at employment, a lot of kind of Turks here, or anybody that's working on this topic here will know that there's been an increased number of employment of Syrians working in the, I don't want to call it the illegal or the black market, but just unofficially working. There are steps that the government is taking to kind of formalize their position. Right now, the Ministry of Labor is supposedly working up a plan where they can identify market needs and specify specific sectors where Syrian refugees can formally and officially start working in. This was delayed due to the election. I predict right now that the Ministry of Labor is back on the ball and they're coming up with this, but this has been about a year that we're talking about, that this keeps being brought up. Legally, I think that's one of the most important steps that Turkey has taken in their legal framework. In 2013, the Turkish government drafted and approved the Foreigner and International Protection Act. This was Turkey's first somewhat refugee policy following the 1994 asylum policy, which was very security oriented, and a lot of criticisms were made on that. So the 2013 Foreigners and International Protection Act, in addition to its obligations for the 1951 Convention, also puts in a new clause about temporary protection, and it specifically outlines temporary protection, who can gain from this kind of service, and what that really means. And that's, I think, an important milestone for the Turkish government. In that there is right to work, in that there is the access to education and access to education. That's a very short kind of summary about the situation right now. I'd like to go into the kind of problems that we're seeing. First of all, and I touched upon this, is statistics. We say that there's 2.2 million refugees in Turkey right now, but to be honest, we don't know. Because we are counting the number of people that are coming into the country, we're not counting the number of people that are leaving the country. We are unable to track the number of people that are returning back to Syria, coming in again, going back and coming in. So 2.2 million can be an overestimate, it can be an underestimate. It's the best we can do, but I think it's important for everybody to realize that. And that ties into what I'm going to talk about, international burden sharing, but it's funny about the European migrant crisis now that we're talking about. And Frontex, as you all know, is the border control for Europe, which kind of is a border police trying to keep migrants out, in my perspective. A little bit of a critical element there. But Frontex put their report out a month ago that it was 700,000 migrants have entered Europe. A good dialogue started with another professor at Birmingham University, where he kind of challenged Frontex and said, wait a minute, how are you so sure about these numbers? How can you be so sure that there isn't double counting? And Frontex I was shocked that they were so honest, and they said, well, we just don't know. If a migrant or a refugee is crossing the border into Greece, we count them. If they leave Greece and go to Albania, and then from Albania they go to Macedonia, we count them again. So they're admitting as well that the 700,000 number that's being reported by the media and the EU is it's an overestimate. And that's used politically by political parties in the EU to shore up a little bit of right-wing support for kind of closing down borders or limiting the people. So I think it's a political issue, and we need to be sensitive on the numbers that we use and the numbers that we kind of portray to people. Number two, this is more to do with the Turkish internal legal policy, and this is Turkey's view on the 1951 convention related to the status of refugees. As everybody knows here, the 1951 convention is the international legal framework that governs refugees. That was the setup that actually set up the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The 1951 was set up, just a little historical kind of insight over here. The 1951 convention was set up specifically to deal with the refugee crisis of World War II. So in the convention, still, there is a geographical limitation where it said that refugees are only considered those who are running away from Europe. Now in 1967, this was changed. There was a protocol that came out which took away the geographical limitation. However, Turkey still holds its geographical limitation. So right now, legally, Turkey only recognizes refugees that are coming from Europe to Turkey. Anybody else that's coming in from another country is not considered a refugee. Instead, there's this formal relationship between the Turkish government and UNHCR, where UNHCR does all of the refugee status determination processes. This is another reason why the Turkish government insisted on calling Syrian refugees guests and not refugees. This is a problem for the Turkish government to kind of be on board with more international human rights standards. I believe in addition to Turkey, only Morocco and I think Angola, I might be wrong, I don't want to quote that, but we're very limited in the amount of countries that still keep this geographical limitation. I think this is one step that we need to immediately annul and formally recognize anybody that's coming through a conflict situation as a refugee. The third problem, or not a problem, but the issue that we need to be focusing on is what you touched upon, is the changing nature of humanitarian provisions for refugees. We are leaving the era of camp-based provision and we're entering the urban refugees. I mean, if we look at the countries in East Africa right now where there is a refugee crisis, it's predominantly camp-based. But if we're looking at Lebanon, if we're looking at Jordan, okay, Zaatari camp is huge, but if we're looking at Turkey especially, predominantly refugees, people, are living in the city amongst us. Provisions need to be made so refugees can be assisted with access to health. Yes, legally they are allowed to access health in Turkey, but we're talking about practical matters. Education, serious problem. When it's in the camp, it's very easy to give education to people. Everybody's there. When you're in an urban setting, or when you're talking about the entire country, where you don't have reliable statistics on where people are, you don't have reliable statistics on the age, actually, you're going to come up with a problem. This mindset has to change as well. I think UNHCR also is changing this kind of mindset as well. For the past decade or so, camp-based is being replaced by urban focus. I think that is the next step. That's where we should be going. I'm going to keep it short on that. Those are my three problems. Maybe we can discuss it later, but statistics, the geographical limitation of Turkey, and camp-based versus urban refugees. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chara, and particularly for pointing out the tension between allowing refugees to live wherever they like in the country and also ensuring that their children are enrolled in educational services. I'd like to turn next to Dr. Sheikha Al-Maskari, who is the chairwoman of the Al-Maskari group in Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates, a formidable businesswoman who broke the glass ceiling in her own country, becoming the first woman owner of a construction company there, but also a very well-known and highly regarded philanthropist who is quite active assisting refugees from this part of the world. Please.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We attend a lot of summits and read a lot of analyses on refugees. To be out of your state is not something new. From the beginning, mankind moved from one country to another looking for greener pastures, or running away from wars and warlords, or from droughts. Now we call them climate refugees. However, now with the help of the media, globalization, the term refugees is identified as an unwanted person. In the United States, there's a huge population of the Latin people, and they call them illegal immigrants. Illegal immigrants are actually refugees who ran away from either poverty or war or a corrupt government. And the situation we are seeing now, we need the expert analysis, but I'm always, when I am in committees to find solutions, we have to understand the three parameters. Number one, these refugees, context of time and space. Both the recipient of the refugees and the refugees themselves. Now with Europe having the migration crisis, as they call it, because at the same time Europe is undergoing a huge economic meltdown. They have their own economic problems and unemployment. So having people coming in thousands night and day is certainly unwelcome. It's not or the lack of compassion, it's just the situation as it is. When you look today at the global level, where are the refugees? We have the displaced Somalis who are over 1 million living in Kenya for over 2 decades, 20 years. They have a refugee city. Going back, we have the Rohingyas. Rohingyas ran away 500 years from an area that was India and Bangladesh and all that into what we know now as Myanmar. 1 million refugees. 500 years they are called refugees. So when we got back, and before we have our noses up and look down at refugees who are being persecuted based on religious ground or economic context, when you look at United States today, the greatness of United States, because they received, the Statue of Liberty says, all the forsaken in the world, you're welcome. So they had the Lutherans from Europe running away from religious persecutions. They had Italians, Germans, from all Europe and from all over the world. What was the process? Everybody was welcome. And that's the secret, the process that actually grew up United States to become a great country and naturally cosmopolitan country. In 1970, after 75, after the Vietnamese War, I witnessed myself the Vietnamese who were pro-United States, were lucky enough to be lifted by US forces were distributed in the Midwest, not in the big cities. Iowa, Indiana, Minnesota. Those are now well settled as Americans. They went there, they didn't know the language, they didn't know the climate, they didn't know anything else. So in the heart of the refugee is that they just will do whatever it takes, life and death, to be somewhere, first of all, where safe, second, greener pastures, and a future for your children. They are not lawbreakers, they are not illegal immigrants, they are not yet registered. And whether there is stigma or prejudice based on religious or economic or geographical or ethnic backgrounds or color, it's just the mindset. When you look at today's diseases of divisive thinking, it's just we are inheriting a mindset that is really sickening. We look at the police forces with African Americans are treated by you as this is one of the greatest democracies very harshly, and they're killed. Is that the whole of United States? Is that the government of United States or the people of United States? No. It's one individual, probably overworked or psychologically prejudiced, that who pulled the trigger and kills that black kid. But today, every death, every violence, first preconceived, before it is even analyzed, is terror. We have achieved it. We have capitalized on the word terrorist act until found otherwise it's going to be considered as a terrorist act. So from the bombardment on Oklahoma, it was not known as a terrorist act. And everywhere else, there are those who are in need of psychological attention, who are somehow at the end of their tethers. They go out there, just like a few weeks ago in California, a young couple who happened to be Muslims, they pulled the trigger and went and killed a lot of innocent people. So my objective is, let's look what's the cause. Because the individual who pulled the trigger, there is something very, very important missing in their value quantum. Either the family unity, the family values, personal values, cultural values, patriotism to their country, and values as good global citizens. If they lack those values out of deficit in parenting, then they are the product that is ready as tinder to erupt. So we put the blame on the warring nations, but on the global scale, we have to look at ourselves, judging others. In South Africa, we have 1 million Zimbabweans. For decades, they're living there in sheer poverty. No health care, no schooling, nothing. They are unwanted. Any crime is a Zimbabwean because they are Zimbabwe refugees. So ladies and gentlemen, we need to sit down as good global citizens and look at really diagnose what's wrong with our world and come with a preventative solution as well as taking care of what is now. As in the aircraft, they say first when the altitude changes, you take the oxygen to your own nose first and then you give it to the child. So at the present, we have to look at the actual crisis of the regional refugees here. We have Iraqi refugees, we have Libyan refugees, almost forgotten. We have the real crisis of 5 million Syrian refugees. Ladies and gentlemen, I mingle night and day with these poor people. They arrive at the borders after months and some of them years of walking or being transported in horrendous conditions, and many of them die on the way. Many children die, and those who reach the borders, they know they are unwanted. They just want somewhere. The women are so traumatized. Those who are breastfeeding, they cannot feed anymore. In this world of ours, 21st century, on the border between Syria and Lebanon, we are losing between 400 to 500 children every month. One cause: famine, malnutrition. Now isn't that disgraceful for us to have children dying of famine? But they do, because they are unwanted refugees. We have in Jordan the refugees. At our UAE Red Crescent camp, we treat them with full respect. We have schools, we have very good hospitals, we have accommodation. We have almost, they go from 12,000 to 8,000 and they come and live. In the wisdom of UAE, one of the best countries in the world, we have the doors open from the Syrian border. They can come in, put them in the database, we check them physically, medical checkups, and then we admit them and give them accommodation, food, and very good care, including schooling and health care. The gate towards Jordan is not allowed for exits of refugees. Why? It's not a detention camp. It's just outside. There are all these traffickers of every despicable type waiting to catch on the refugees. And with all these stories, I will send you to Europe. Now, depending on the status of the refugee, if they sold everything, they have some money, they pay traffickers, and they get to the borders of Europe or the borders of Turkey. So when they arrive, let's say in Turkey, I visit 8 camps on the 1,000 kilometers Turkish-Syrian borders. First of all, I salute Turkey. The truth. I pay tribute to Turkey. Turkey has recognized across the borders are our brothers. They come in as our guests. That word, guest, means a lot to a refugee, because a human being, more than anything, really wants dignity. Secondly, compassion. Third is the physical care, health care and everything else. But I have witnessed on the Turkish-European borders, and in Bulgaria, Estonia, Hungary, all those places, after months and months of walking and going, I had asked, I have a team, and I asked, what's the most urgent need they have so we can provide them, because they are just bent completely. Whatever it takes, they will cross the border. And the most urgent need was to have children's shoes. Those poor children have been walking in the desert, sun, sand, rain, no proper feed. with lack of water, and they survived to get to the European borders. Bare feet. It's raining, so cold. As we know, Syrians are light-skinned. All those little children have boils because they are walking bare feet. Now, I have spoken to UNCHR, there's, the United Nations, UNCHR, Red Crescent, Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders. We all mean well, but the numbers are overwhelming. So another tribute I would pay, especially to Germany, the Woman Personality of the Year, Angela Merkel. He came out in Europe and he said, they're welcome, not going to please. And they went in hundreds of thousands, but at the end, there was overwhelming reaction against her policy. Why? It's the context of time and space. Germany is feeling the economic stress, and they don't want the refugees to take the menial job at very low rate. Today in Beirut, the dirtiest jobs, who is the workers? With no salary, only little bit of food in their mouths? The Syrian boys. 6, 7, under 10. These little boys work in garages and everywhere. They clean restaurants. They just don't have, I ran my time off. Okay. So we have to find, number one, to look at refugees. What is their condition? Mentally traumatized, physically assaulted. If you see the Syrian children, girls, who are sexually molested, unbelievable, with the border guards and in the Arab countries or the borders with Syria. It is known very well, if anybody is interested, in front of the camps, there are caravans. Those caravans, ladies and gentlemen, I'm so ashamed to say it, are actually houses of ill repute, where Syrian little girls underage are taken in and paid per day just the money to buy food for their children. This is the situation. And they are fake marriages. This old guy will get a little 14-year-old, just he has passport, the Syrian child does not have passport. They make a wedding certificate, congratulations, she's your wife, you can take her out and traffic her out. I paid tribute to Sweden, the first country I went and asked for visas. By the way, from day number one, the Kingdom of Sweden, the King and Queen of Sweden expressed so much compassion. They respect the refugees. They avail all facilities, healthcare, schooling, social workers to the refugees. Today, we have over 65,000 refugees in a nation of 9 million people, over 4%. But the moment they arrive, welcome home. They look after them with absolutely. I was last week astounded. We were working on the solution with His Royal Majesty the King and Her Royal Majesty the Queen. From 8:30 in the morning, sitting together until 11 o'clock, the King and the Queen with us, just taking the notes and doing everything else. Royalty, European royalty, just to see the solutions for the refugees. This tribute, I told the Queen, I salute Sweden, I salute their Royal Majesties, and I salute Turkey. Now, please give me another 2 minutes. We have refugees internally displaced, but I'm thinking of the street children They are not refugees. Every megapolis in the world, Mumbai, one city, has 1 million street children who live and die in the street. Then we have in the city of Cairo 600,000 children who live and die in the city. Almost so many megapolis in the world. They are our children. They are the future. They are the uncared for, internally displaced in the streets refugees. So we need to just to find a solution. And I declare it. We are going to declare afterwards, but I will do it beforehand. I have proposed, and I already got a lot of a partnership to create TAP, Together Against Poverty. First priority, bring back the refugees, build them home. Second priority, our obligation to the future generation of the world, we take off the children from the streets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to invite Mr. Hussam Abu Isa, the Vice Chair of the Board of Directors of Salam International, to say a few words about education about refugees. I'm afraid we only have about 10 minutes left for this session, so I'm going to ask you to be brief, and I'm also going to apologize to my fellow panelists and to the audience. I have to catch a flight, so I also have to step out immediately. But thank you all very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. Actually, it hurts me to talk about refugees and education together. Today, most of the world, they're abusing the refugees, and they're doing mostly nothing about the refugees. They do as little as they can, and they promote it as big as they can. The amount of problems and disaster the refugees, the Syrian refugees specifically, they is humongous. Sheikha talked about abusing of prostitution. Today you see children of the age of 10, boys who lost their mother and father, and they are working as prostitutes in order to be able to live. Today we have a very serious problem today. We have hundreds of thousands of refugees around the world who are connotated to be bad, but those generations, they are a generation to be educated, or otherwise tomorrow they will become the criminals of tomorrow's future, and we are neglecting it. How many we are talking, putting them in schools, how many we are putting them in proper health care? There's nothing, much is done to the magnitude of the problem. Even though I believe that a lot can be done, but many factors are playing a role in order to delay helping those refugees. Today we talk about educating the refugees, educating the people, educating the illiterate. What is education? What is really education? Is education to have somebody who can read and write only? Is this education what we're looking for? Unfortunately, the cause of the irony of the refugees are the educated people. They are the really educated people. They are the decision makers, are the educated people to cause war, to change wars. The refugees above Syria, we already know about them before even the war started. Turkey, in the early stage before the war, they already prepared camps for those refugees. So literally, I have a problem with the educated people who are taking decisions to take war and to cause the misery of those refugees. I have a problem with those educated people who are teaching their audience fanaticism. Religious people who read and write, they are teaching them how to be fanatic in mosques, in churches, in synagogues, in Sikhs, you name them, in every single. Our education system is not ready to prepare humanitarian educated people with humanity. I'm not talking about the small works done by individuals. I'm talking about a world education. Today you hear somebody who's going to be, who's supposed, I hope he will never be the leader of the world. One of the leaders, Donald Trump. What's he saying? He doesn't want to have Muslims coming in or put a ban on them. This is an educated person. What do we expect from the small guys? Even this history of racism and this unfairness, if you go back in history, the Prince of England, am I offered? Why you change places? There is an organization called World Wildlife Fund, which was created by His Royal Highness, the Prince of England, the husband of Her Majesty, the Queen of England. What does he say? If I was reincarnated, I would like to return to a killer virus to help slow the overpopulation. This is an educated decision. Guys, for God's sake, we are in the wrong process of our education. I have many quotes of different people who are really causing our misery. And unfortunately, we're holding conferences, wasting billions of dollars on studies, conferences, and these problems still persist today, tomorrow, day after tomorrow, and it never changes. Poverty, non-education, refugees, killing. In Myanmar, hundreds of thousands of Muslims being put in camps. Decision taken by the educated people that we don't want them to be part of our society, even though they are part of the Myanmar societies. So all those studies, all things, if we don't really work on a world and a humanitarian education system, we will never and ever, and every time we will meet in a conference, we'll talk about the same subjects, we'll talk about the same decision, and we talk about the same studies, and spending the billions of dollars. And what happens? Our refugees getting bigger, the uneducated, the unhuman educated, they are controlling more the world societies, and we are getting nowhere. Today, people, they want to create wars, those education. Let's talk about the pharmaceutical, for example, who are scientists and educated. They have medicines for some world diseases. What do they do about it? They keep it in the safe because there's not enough profit margin in it. They wait till the disease explodes. Then they put it in the market to make profitability. Sometime in the EU, when they have an educated decision, oversupply of milk powder or milk, what do? They want to maintain the price level. So they use a certain portion market at a high price level. The rest, they dump it into the sea.
Mr. Abu Issa, just being
My 20 minutes did not finish.
Yes, I know, but you are from the family of the International Cooperation Platform, so that's why I would like to ask you another 1 minute, then we have to pass to Mr. Pals.
I'll take 30 seconds.
I need your support.
I'll take only, I'll close it. That's okay. No, anyway, my message is clear. Really, my top message is our education system sucks. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, for this word. We need a humanitarian education system to start immediately, to start bringing up young leaders, not to be like the examples I gave, Trump, and they are like him, to lead the world. Otherwise, ladies and gentlemen, kiss it bye-bye. Thank you very much.
As the director of the Bosphorus Summit, I have to take the moderator part. So our last panelist is Mr. Daniel Puls. He's the CEO of PASS, an entity that aims to maximize the impact of philanthropy globally. Current vice chair of the International Cooperation Platform, and he recently visited some refugee camps in Turkey near Syrian border. He is the former vice president of the Atlantic Council. Please, Mr. Puls.
Thank you so much. This is a tough act to follow, I have to say, and I'm going to try to be brief. I prepared a talk, but I want to start with some observations from my most recent visits to some of the camps both in Turkey and Jordan and elsewhere, thousands of small businesses have sprung out of these camps. You know, you can't hold the human spirit of enterprise down. There's a circus of young boys that I was just amazed by, you know, their ability to throw themselves through the air with no pads, no equipment of any kind. Song and dance and theater, and a young preteen boy looking at me and saying, when you think of us, think of your own children. And I do think of my own children when I am visiting these children who my colleague referred to as the unwanted. I don't think of them as unwanted, though. I would say that these are our children. This is our future. And if we don't attend to our children now, we really have no claim to say in the future, how did this happen? Because we are at least partially to blame. I want to, as an American, I have a great regard for Turkey, its people, its culture, and its generosity to guests. The camps that I visited are among the best in the world, if not the best in the world. And they've just made an extraordinary commitment to giving the people who live in these camps some level of dignity. You see in these camps satellite dishes that, you know, why, some people would say, well, why would you give them satellite dishes? What else are they going to do? They're there for hours on end. So it's really admirable. Government actors in Turkey have made a genuine effort to reach the 85% of non-camped refugees in the country. For instance, Turkish ministries have set up second shifts within Turkish schools and built new school facilities to accommodate Syrian refugees, most of whom are children. I would like to see some of that type of action in my own country for our own children. And Turkey is doing it for these people who have come fleeing conflict. The Turkish private sector is also contributing. Maya Holdings, one of your prominent private sector companies, the parent company of IKEA Turkey, has supported a psychosocial trauma intervention program for traumatized Syrian youth, Project Lift, which is really a role model for programs of its type in other parts of the world. Syria may be the largest humanitarian crisis in the world since World War II, but it's far from the only one. In Kenya, decades-long encamped populations still lack basic needs. Many of them literally collect grass, and put it in bags and live off literally grass. In Afghanistan, we know what's going on there with many protracted exile in Pakistan and Iran. While I'm going the wrong way, sorry. And while, we really have our attention on the Syrian catastrophe, we've stopped watching what's happening in Ukraine, where over 1 million people are living displaced, many without access to medicine, without access to health care of any kind. In Ecuador, we have refugees that have fled the cartel violence, and on and on and on. So this refugee IDP crisis is profound, and it's only getting bigger. Today, 1 in 122 people is a refugee an asylum seeker, or an IDP. It's roughly the population of the United Kingdom. And if you look at global trends, this is only going to become more profound. PASS, in partnership with one of our clients, a US-UK registered NGO, worked with a Turkish business person and philanthropist who's made a commitment of $20 million to support education and health projects in Turkey and Syria. Over 5 years, the financial commitment will go towards increasing educational access, community centers, health clinics, etc. Hamdi Ulukaya, who many of you have read about, the founder and CEO of Chobani, has committed at least half of his wealth in his lifetime to refugees worldwide. But in spite of this, it's really a drop in the bucket. In a recent visit to camps in Jordan, we were told that only 70% or less of the total need that UNICEF has looked at is being covered right now. In the United States, in the United Kingdom, and elsewhere, the Muslim community is engaged, but by its own estimation, it's fragmented and far from cohesive. And it's not clear how much of the billions of dollars of Zakat fundraising are actually going toward international response. Some of that has to do with onerous laws that make it very, very difficult, and there are other factors. It's said that the refugee populations are difficult to reach, yet there are hundreds of civil society organizations working on the front lines of these conflicts, which lack the funding they could use to expand their life-saving and life-enhancing work. But the story gets worse. Where there is funding, the funding mechanisms are not strategic or sustainable. Many of you are business people in the room. The average length of displacement for refugees is over 17 years. The average length of a humanitarian action is seven years. Yet public funders deliver funds in 6 to 12-month increments. We know of one organization implementing projects, water projects, in Africa that has trucked water into a refugee camp for over 10 years. It absolutely makes no sense. I mean, it doesn't, from a business standpoint or any standpoint, it makes no sense at all. So financing is not strategic, and that needs to be changed. That's why I'm coming to you with a call to action. That with a shared purpose, we launch an international initiative to bring together the resources that are needed. As research has illustrated, migration politics are deeply fraught and politically contested. I want to remind all of you that when we talk about the humanitarian principles, we're talking about humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and operational independence. Humanity, meaning human suffering, must be addressed wherever it is found. The purpose of humanitarian action is to protect life and health and ensure respect for human beings. Neutrality, actors must not take sides in hostilities or engage in controversies of a political, racial, religious, or ideological nature.
Your last 2 minutes, Mr. Paz.
Thank you. So I'm saying that we reframe the way that we fund these organizations and we look for ways to work together. And I'm open to your comments and your partnership. And I would love to work with all of you. And out of respect for the next panel, I'm going to stop there. And thank you all very much.
this roundtable is so important because we have 2.3 million visitors in Turkey at that moment, only from Syria and from other countries, similar numbers perhaps. And then I'm an economist, I'm working also for these refugees and this kind of subjects on my academical part, and we are thinking that maybe even one day everything is solved in Syria, maybe 1.5 million of Syrian people, they will decide to continue to live in Turkey. So that's why for the Turkish government, we try to do our best to be together. Hopefully, we are really good sentiments and maybe as a tradition to be host for all kinds of refugees, because this region is so interesting about these subjects. So I would like to thank all the distinguished panelists. Please.
I just wanted to say that I am the grandson of a refugee. My grandmother came to the United States with a nickel in her pocket. And in 1979, when I was graduating from school, she pulled the nickel out and said, "I came to this country with this nickel." And I looked at it and I said, "But Nana, this nickel says 1978. And she said, "Shut up, this is my story."
That's really correct.
Gentlemen,
Sorry,
thank you very much.
Let me add, on top of that, I'm the son of a Palestinian refugee.
We would like to offer our highest regards to our panelists and this great session. Now I would like to ask Mr. Kerem Alkin to present our plug of honor to our great panelists. Thank you. Professor Dr. Kerem Alkin is presenting the plug of honor to our panelists.
Professor, call the professor.